Did you guys know the witches from Macbeth canonically have beards? If you don't know me, my name is Kaylee. I'm a Shakespeare academic. Today, I want to talk about gender in the Elizabethan era in my JSTOR and Chill sweatshirt. To think about how we understand gender in a historical context whatsoever, you first need to understand that the way in which you probably conceive gender now, if you are listening to me on this TikTok in English, and you are probably American or European based on my statistics, the way you think about gender was invented probably around in the 1950s, was around when that got solidified. The concept of gender obviously has been ebbing and flowing the entirety of human history, right? But the way that you think about it is not the way that people in the past did. And in general, people need to start understanding the way in which, like, just because your brain works the way that it does and you think about things a certain way, it doesn't mean that that's how that worked forever. And also, we're not at society, and the way that things move forward, right, isn't a linear timeline. It's not like things have just steadily gotten better civil rights wise for hundreds of thousands of years. That's not true. There are societies that are better to live in, that would have been better to live in if you had this identity, or would have been better to live in if you had that identity, or whatever. But everything is weird. Everything is complicated. But the Elizabethans did not have the same knowledge of science that we do. So, their conceptualization of gender and sex were different because of that. For example, they thought that uteruses could move around the body. They thought that if a woman exercised and worked hard enough, that her vaginal canal could fall out and become a penis. Because women were just men inverted. Or, like, different. They also, though, thought that women also had to orgasm during sex in order to conceive. And that's actually held over from the medieval period. But people tend to think that because it was longer ago, that means that their idea of gender was much more rigid than ours. That's not true. You probably know that Shakespeare's female characters were all played by young boys on stage. That's an example of cross-dressing that was extremely common because women were not allowed on stage. However, there are other early modern plays from the time who talk about cross-dressing women as well. The Roaring Girl, which was put on, I think, just after Shakespeare retired, is Dekker and Middleton, who Shakespeare worked with Dekker and Middleton. These are his contemporaries, right? And it's about a woman who was a real woman who became one of the first women to be on stage during one of those performances because she came on and she was herself on stage, who was a thief and cross-dressed all the time. That is one of my other favorite early modern plays. And then you also have Shakespeare's women cross-dressing within the plays all the time. So that's a young boy who is dressed up as an adult woman who is then dressed up as an adult man. We also, during the early modern period, have eunuchs, which I argue is a third gender. Not in the same way that being non-binary or experiencing a third gender today would be a third gender, because eunuchs were forcibly created. But there were times where churches or performing groups would find a young boy who had a great voice and kidnap him off the street, or convince his parents to sell him to them so that they could castrate him and keep that voice forever. And eunuchs were treated very differently from both men and women. They were treated in a lot of ways as a third gender. They're very interesting. Just because we know that eunuchs are, like, quote-unquote biologically male, and we use he, him pronouns for eunuchs, doesn't mean that they weren't treated as third gender in a lot of ways. So why did I start talking about the beards on the witches in Macbeth? It's Act 1, Scene 3, by the way. Banquo's line here is, you should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. Now remember also in the Tudor era, like, we don't have the science behind why men grow beards and women don't, generally, right? So being beardless is not only indicative of being feminine, but also indicative of being young. This is why young boys play women. And the witches are called the Weird Sisters, right? And at the time, weird means fantastical, knowing of fate, stuff like that. Like metaphysical, less so like weird, like more like, ooh, weird. That's why you see people spell it with a Y sometimes as it was spelled, was to try and differentiate that. These powerful beings that can tell fate are distinguished as being outside of a gender binary. Later, we also have Lady Macbeth talking about unsex me here, and she has a lot of interesting stuff to say about gender and who she is as a person, and miscarriages and birth and how that relates to who you are as a woman. This also tells us a lot about how gender presentation was tied to gender. If you presented as a gender, you were basically interpreted as that gender in the Elizabethan era. That could be as simple as putting on a dress or a pair of pants, because that was, I mean, you're not looking, right? Like, there isn't a lot of overlap, so people aren't looking. There is absolutely no reason to put on a dress unless you want to be perceived as a woman. Many of the crux of Shakespeare's plays has fully to do with the idea that you can fool people with your gender. You absolutely can. They're playing on the idea that these young boys are dressed as adult women, or dressed as boys, or and the presentation is the thing that is letting you suspend that disbelief. Anyway, when we're thinking about gender in Shakespeare, we're thinking about something that is not nearly as fixed as I think that we think about it today. And I think we are always due a reminder that transgender people have always been here and will always be here, and society is just weird sometimes. Anyway, I would love to see a production where the witches actually have beards. Because why do we never put that on stage either?